Okay, Ransirini, can we start then? You are recording, hope we can post it.
Yes, started recording.
In our YouTube channel. Okay. Yes, I would like to welcome Professor Buddhi Marambe for the first guest lecture of the OUTA, Open University Teachers Association for this year. And he's also a senior professor. And personally, I was attracted to Professor Buddhi Marambe's work when Sirius reported that news article under this title, Senior Professor Buddhi Marambe was removed from all posts with Agriculture Ministry. That was the point really attracted me towards Professor Marambe's work, and I was very much impressed. In a context that the Sri Lankan party-based political culture and politicians have shown a trend to hate experts in general and those who talk truth in particular. We need a group of academic community like Professor Marambe to take this society forward and also to give a real meaning for the institute called the university in which we are serving. In this context, we invited Professor Marambe to deliver his talk on the title Agriculture Crisis in Sri Lanka and the role of the academics. We need a group of academics stand for what is right and what is justifiable according to disciplines that we represent. Professor Marambe need no introduction. However, I would like to share with you a brief introduction about Professor Marambe. Professor Buddhi Marambe obtained his BSc degree in agriculture from the University of Peradeniya and Masters in Agriculture, D. Agri from the Hiroshima University, Japan. He has more than 34 years of experience as an academic at the Department of Crop Science of Faculty of Agriculture, University of Peradeniya. His research interest includes weed science, climate change, and food security. With more than 150 research publications, he has a lot of citations. I was referring to his Google Scholar page in the morning. Professor Marambe has also won the Presidential Award and National Research Council Merit Award in Sri Lanka for scientific research. Professor Marambe is the chairman of the National Invasive Species Specialist Groups and a member of the National Expert Committee on Climate Change Adaptation of the Ministry of Environment since 2012. Professor Marambe was also a member of the government delegation in climate negotiations at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. During the past 8 years, he was also the Assistant Secretary of Sri Lanka Organic Culture Movement for the period 2001 and 2003. While being an academic, he has also served as a non-executive member of the board of several private sector organizations, providing technical guidance to agriculture-related operations, and council member and also executive committee member of many professional associations. Professor Marambe has provided his services as a consultant to the World Bank, European Union, UNDP, FAO, ICRAF, and CIAT in nationally and internationally important issues related to climate change, food security, and agriculture. Professor Marambe will make his presentation for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then the discussion will start. Discussion session will be moderated by Professor Harshana Rambukwella. Professor Marambe, I would like to invite you to make your presentation now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Beyaratna. Thank you very much, Open University of Sri Lanka, the Teachers Union, for inviting me for this occasion. I consider it as a privilege, of course, to talk to you all at this particular stage. Well, Professor Beyaratna, during his introduction, brought up a very interesting entry point. He spoke of a newspaper article or news item that highlighted my name as well as the Minister of Agriculture, explaining situations, saying that I have been removed from all my posts from Ministry of Agriculture. I didn't expect that you to bring that thing at this particular stage, but since the matter came up, I must tell you that I had never held a post at the Ministry of Agriculture to date. So, of course, but as academia, you and me, many people have been invited to serve in committees at the different ministries, different associations. We never asked for it, we have been invited. So the inviting authority can always remove people from any kind of membership. So we respect that part. But as Professor Pieratta quite correctly said, one important thing that came out of all these things, the negative political influence that can be there with respect to academia, the ways of expression, because academic freedom gives us a great opportunity, has given us a great opportunity to express our views, is freedom of expression that we have, but of course, with responsibility and accountability. So, and that matter moves forward, and the message given, especially to younger generation, is not going to be good. So this is something that should never happen in the future. As an individual, that's a different story. But as an academia, even this type of misinformation given to the public is not going to be any good. But of course, people appoint us to certain committees, and people, the appointing authority has always got the authority, definitely has been appointed to remove people as well. Of course, you can give reasons, but in certain cases you cannot. So with that little introduction regarding the entry point that was taken by Professor Pieratta to introduce me, let me move on to this presentation that I was asked to do. I sincerely hope I can have the screen share. Yes, I'm having it, so that's great. So I'm moving into my presentation, and let me start on with the first slide, and then go ahead. As the Professor Pieratta told, I'll be spending about 35 to 40 minutes in this presentation, and then we'll open up for discussion. And there are two specific segments in my presentation to talk to you about the agriculture crisis, giving you facts and figures, not blowing things out of my mind without any factual correct information. So all what I'm going to present you is the actual scenario that has been happening based on data, scientifically varied information, so that we can all make our own judgment on that. And I must also tell you the other key word is the role of academia in this particular scenario, not only in this crisis as we call it right now, but of course in other social crises that we have, social, environment, whatever, or the economic crises that we have faced in the past, today, and of course in the foreseeable future. What would be our role play? Let me start with the latter part first. I think that is important about the role of academia in such crisis situations, so that I can bring in information to show you how academia can be proactive to educate people, not to bring people onto roads or go against an existing or past or future governments, but to make sure people are aware and they will make informed decisions for the benefit on their own livelihood as well as on the country's economy. That's an important thing, and I fervently hope that academia will support the country's development as they have done in the past, but in a more proactive manner, because we all do understand that every time when academia and scientists have come forward, there are taglines that comes to those academia, whether you have been paid by a private sector agency or whether you are being backed by certain other parties, which actually goes against the existing government policies and so on. This is not the case. Even if a government elected by people, of course, governments are elected by people in our case. If a government take a policy decision and implements something that is not going to benefit the society and the economy, it's a job of the academia as well as learned people to make sure the message get across to the government as well as to the masses, so that there will be kind of a helpful momentum in the society as well, where the governments can always correct course. Governments appointed by the people can always correct course and make sure the country's development is in the correct path. That's the whole objective, nothing else. And that's one of the key reasons why I'm sure I've been invited to talk in this forum, and that's the objective of my talk as well. I use two different terms. I think I use both terms. I'm talking about academic freedom and about the autonomy. And to discuss about this, several people also asked me questions whether there is a pressure from your own entity, your own organization. When people heard that I've been removed from certain positions, so they were worried that I've been removed from my university position. There's been nothing of that nature, and people were asking whether there were issues from the university, trying to see whether the momentum that is being given or taken by academia, not only me but many others, are going to be blocked, or efforts have been made something to do so. So far to date, I must tell you very frankly, there was no such momentum, at least that I have started feeling. There's always freedom of expression. And to talk about it, I thought to bring out an extract from an article written by Professor Deepika Udagama about 10 years ago. You know, is a well-recognized and respected lawyer and also human rights activist and an academic who is there at the Peradeniya University or was there at the Columbia University earlier. And I think this will be really helpful for everyone to understand what it means. And I'm extracting this wording exactly from the article written by Professor Deepika Udagama. It's a newspaper article that appeared in Sunday Times. I'm sorry I could not get the dates clearly. I must thank Professor Rohan Fernando for guiding me towards accessing these articles, not today or yesterday, from the time that I started talking about these activities, these things, and also many other academics from the university, academia from the university and scientists joined the bandwagon, not as a team, but as individuals. That's the best part of it, to express their views freely. In 1999, there was an effort by the then government under the guidance of Mrs. Chandrika Bandaranaike Mathura, Her Excellency the President at that time, to amend the Universities Act number 16 of 1978, bringing in some important or some aspect which will negatively impact on the university community. And there was a case in the course that was challenging this bill that was put forward to the parliament about the constitutionality of the bill presented in 1999. And the interesting point is that when the court heard this petition allowed to proceed, then the petition was allowed to proceed. Petition was made by Professor Deepika Udagama and many other parties, I must tell you. And this case finally ended up with a historic judgment given by Supreme Court in 1999, because in this judgment they referred to the value and the recognition of academic freedom and autonomy. Let me give you part of the decision, the court citation that was given, to read it for you. I don't want to read, but let me read it for you. It gave the approval of the definition and scope of academic freedom and autonomy offered by the Lima Declaration on academic freedom and autonomy, which was way back in 1988 and later accepted by UNESCO in 1997 as well, and identify the autonomy of institutions of higher education adopted by the General Assembly of World University Service and also UNESCO standards in 1997. This is a very important point when we look at the freedom of expression, which is a privilege, I must tell you, and the right also for the academia who are in the fields of their specific subject areas to look at the overall country development, for example, in a holistic manner and freely express their views, but of course with accountability and also responsibility on what we say. Just to bring a slide to show you what the Lima Declaration is, you can definitely download it very easily. And this Lima Declaration came from the 68th General Assembly of World University Service. The meeting was held in September 1988 to earmark the 40th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So this is where the Lima Declaration came up. I'm not going to show you the overall Lima Declaration, but the important part is to understand how the Lima Declaration has defined the term academic freedom, which is something extremely important because we find hardly any definitions being laid out elsewhere except for this Lima Declaration. People have started explaining of academic freedom on a different ways. So let me bring this accepted document by the countries in the world where the academic freedom very clearly states. I'm not going to read this part in part A. What it basically says is there is freedom of expression. But of course, we simply cannot ignore the responsibility and accountability part. You cannot come and tell whatever the thing that we want unless it's evidence-based, for example, where you can prove it. You can come up with assumption and hypothesis, but you cannot bring myths into the society, for example, and take the whole society on a ride. That's the message that we can get out of all these issues. So with that, little introduction, ladies and gentlemen. Let me tell you one important thing that is there in the society right now, where academia can play a bigger role play. I mean, we have played a role play in the past, but I really see that it's not adequately enough to make sure people's minds are changed on the correct direction, correct attitude, and building up of correct skills and then the knowledge base as well. But the important thing is, in most of the cases, when there's a myth that has been put forward by even a fellow scientist or academia, maybe on clergy based on religious activities and so on. What we have usually done is have a smile and have a discussion over a drink, for example, or at a party. We simply try to ignore that. I mean, people have gone nuts even to come up with such ideas. But the danger is that when academia has kept their mouth shut for a longer period of time, invariably, undoubtedly, and without any hindrance, those myths have started spreading across borders. That's where the superstition part has played a major important role even in our decision making. And the myths have taken a whole society on a ride. I think it's a job of the academia as the learned members of the society, as well as scientists, to make sure the real idea, the real conceptual format of matter should be put forward scientifically and also in an understandable language to the general public, so that everybody will realize what is going on and understand what should have been done. Even if a government, people elected government, try to deviate from their normal course, significantly and negatively affect the country's economy, the only way to get them back on the correct course of action is education, training, getting the messages across. There are many ways to do that. We may we have used a wrong pathway, but there are different ways that you can use. So I'm not going to do all the pathways right now, but I really wanted to talk to you about the academia's role play by not keeping their mouth shut, not being silent, not to go into streets every time and we're having placards and go some positions. No, there are ways. Of course, there have been success stories, I must tell you. I have to admit, must thank FUTA as well for all the efforts that have been taken in the past. But there may be issues that we have to look into more pragmatically as well, to make sure the governments are more focused on the country's development, and while considering the views positively expressed by people who are in the real subject areas, or we call them subject matter experts and so on. This is something extremely important. If we do not play a role in the society more proactively, our country will be in trouble. It's already in trouble, as you know right now, but we simply cannot allow things of this nature continue in the future. And what the point I'm talking to you about is something that close to my heart as well as your heart, is about the agriculture and food security of the country. Let me come back to that point. So my main issue, the core subject area of my discussion, bringing in the role play of the academia to this whole agriculture crisis that have been created. I will bring back the points to you to show how the decision making that has been done in the recent past has negatively affected that was an industry, an economic sector in this country that was already progressing, and how a downfall of a given decision can take place within a flash. And we as academia, we as learned people in this particular scenario cannot keep our mouth shut without expressing our views frankly, not tagged to any political party, not tagged to any industry, for example, but genuinely focusing on the country's development scenario. That's an important thing. So while doing so, the issue is that not to get brainwashed even by listening to my talk, if at all, if there's going to be anything like that. The important thing is that, as explained by Professor Freeman on Twitter that he sent in 2020, he said, stupidity is knowing the truth, seeing the truth, but believing in lies. This is where the problem is. I'm not pointing fingers at anyone, but remember, we as academia have to play a bigger role in the society. People look up to us. People want advices from us. Let's try to give them the correct advice. People includes policymakers, politicians. Let us give them the correct advice. Let us not take people on a ride, and let us not try to achieve our own whims and fancies by using national budget, for example. That's the best thing I can tell you at this stage as an academic with 34 years of experience after working in several sectors while being in the university for 34 long years. So that's the first message. that I want to let everyone know as members, fellow members of the academic community from the Open University of Sri Lanka. Let me now come into more subject matter related things. I'm not going to take you on a long journey on this subject, but I'm going to bring you statistics showing you figures to let you know how important the evidence-based decision making and how detrimental the experts, subject experts like you and me, keeping quiet for a longer period of time, not trying to pinpoint issues and bring the government's decision in correct course. Very unfortunate. We all know about food security. Food security is something goes beyond from food availability, something goes beyond from the home gardening that we do, the backyard gardening that we do, is basically having access to affordable, safe, nutritious food today, tomorrow, for everyone at all times. That's an important thing that we have to understand. It's a very difficult thing to achieve when you go through it. And you know, food security can be achieved by two main ways. One way is to maximize the contribution of agriculture in a given country towards achieving food security. And second way is to import food material to provide the nation adequate required food according to these conditions that have been given here whenever there is a gap. I use the term whenever, but we have seen that the gaps have been there right throughout. Well, there may have been issues regarding the technologies, regarding the process that we have adopted. We have to correct course by looking at what has happened in the past, but going by the real facts, not by the myths or things coming from unknown powers and so on. That's an important thing to remember whenever the time we make decisions. And this is the guy that a lot of people blame nowadays and a lot of people even praise nowadays. Dr. Norman Borlaug, who was the father of the term called Green Revolution, who came back with the idea towards the end of Second World War, the World War II, somewhere in 1945, to make sure the famine that was already on the cards in a country like Mexico to be overcome, as well as in other countries as well. His effort was to overcome this by producing high-yielding varieties. In other words, producing more from the unit land area. That was the target. So this gentleman had done a lot of good because we have already seen the dividends. We have already seen the benefits of the Green Revolution. I will come back to you, show you some information from Sri Lanka to give an indication how Green Revolution has supported us, supported agriculture in this country. But you have to remember, we all have to understand, nothing on this planet Earth is 100% giving 100% positive contributions or 100% negative contribution. It's the checks and balances that we have to weigh always when we take a decision. That's why I told you from the very beginning, we have to go through evidence-based decision making. And that is the role play of the academia and scientists to make sure correct facts and figures being provided to the government of Sri Lanka to make sure that they will take the correct decision. If they go take a wrong decision, even after providing them with the correct information, we have to exaggerate, you have to accelerate our efforts, but not to keep our mouth shut and shy away. That is not the way academia should perform. That's what I always thought. I'm telling my students always, don't forget to tell the truth. If you tell the truth, tell the correct facts, it will be very difficult. It's like very difficult to go against that. I'm sure you will understand. Even in a faculty board that we do, if you can put forward an argument where there cannot be a factual counter argument coming from the other side, your argument will win. Definitely. Right. And in those cases, nobody can blame you saying that you are the chairperson of a given committee was biased towards a gentleman or lady who put forward that idea, academia, for example. So it's an argument that we frame based on evidences, put it forward in an understandable language. So if there is going to be any sort of opposition, for example, from square one, that opposition will not come up when they do not have a good counter argument with proper scientific basis. That's how society will progress. What has happened here is that we as academia has failed in this case with respect to agriculture decision. I myself have to be blamed. I'm telling you as the first instance, that's an important thing. Myself have to be blamed because I also went through that pathway which I explained earlier. I was laughing at people who are spreading nonsense, but that nonsense became the order of the day, very unfortunately. Now, why people like Norman Borlaug in 1945 came forward? They may have been backed by many other authorities and people. Leave that aside for the moment. Look at what has happened. The agricultural land that has been available per capita, that was foreseen by people like Norman Borlaug and even the Sri Lankan scientists at that time, because people understood the land availability, agricultural land availability per capita is decreasing. Now look at the world average that's here in this red color line, the second top line. But look at Bhutan. I'm going to bring issues related to Bhutan in a while, because Bhutan is the first country to declare that they are going to go fully organic. But they had to, I mean, due to, I mean, not saying unfortunately, unfortunately, they had to reverse their decision in 3 years since they started declaring that officially. Come back to that point also. And look at where Sri Lanka is, the green line, second line from bottom. Where you can see in this case, our agricultural land per capita has been declining. Now, this declining land per capita with increasing population, slow but steadily increasing population, still demands more food in the future. That's why Norman Borlaug, Dr. Norman Borlaug understood in 1945, looking at Mexico and other developing countries. And that's why our own scientists identified this in 1950s, saying that we have to make sure our increasing population will have to be fed with good quality food, but of course with higher yields per unit land area. The productivity component had to play more role. There have been a lot of other things coming up into the picture, but due to time limitation, I'm not going to talk about it. Now let's see this declining in land and where we are right now. According to the latest statistics and global databases, we have about 13,003 million hectares of land. And out of that, 37.6% is agricultural area. And more importantly, only 1.5% of the agricultural land is being cultivated to organic agriculture. This is something that has to be kept in mind. 72 million when you talk about numbers, but people rarely talk about the quantity of agricultural land. 4,889 million hectares. Now that being kept on a backstage, we always bring this, when you talk about millions, people get attracted, but it's only 1.4% of the agricultural land. People can say it is growing, yes, the technologies are growing. Organic agriculture is also a technology, and conventional system, the technologies are proliferating at a rapid rate. And people talk about the growth rates as well. When the starting number is small, you all know when the next number increase, then in increased number even small, the percentage increase will be higher. It's like moving from 1 to 2. People can say there's a 100% increase, but moving from 101 to 102, there's a big difference, as we all understand. Sorry, I'm not in challenge your intellectual capacity in doing this simple mathematics, but I thought repeating this is important. Sometimes we ignore these simple facts. That's an important thing. So while knowing this land issue has been there, productivity issues have been there. Remember I told you, after Dr. Norman Borlaug came up with the idea of this green revolution, bringing up with high yielding varieties to increase the land productivity, for example, and the Sri Lankan scientists started working on it, especially for rice, where we consider as our major staple food crop. As you know, since gaining independence in 1948, all successive governments have been putting up a lot of weight to make sure our rice production or the paddy production or paddy culture is going to reach its heights, because that's the major staple. And every time when we, though term food security goes beyond rice, but we always start thinking that when the rice, so the self-sufficiency of rice is there, that we are quite satisfied and quite, we feel safe in terms of food security. Remember, food security is national security. If anything that challenges national security, or in other words, food security, that cannot be tolerated, because we are affected. A country like us, especially a country like Sri Lanka, who are working on a very thin budget margin. Even now, we cannot talk about even a thin budget margin right now. We have to be very careful of our food security, and we try to plan well not to jeopardize the activity that is taking place in the country. To give you an example, let me come up with the historical development with respect to paddy production in Sri Lanka. And this information I'm comparing 2020 with 1940, traditional and modern. Let's go back to 80 years ago, 1940. We had a population of only about 6 million. And we have imported 60% of the rice requirement to feed the nation. People may blame the foreign invasion. That is true. People may blame the disease epidemics and so on. That is true. World War I, World War II, and the Spanish flu that affected all of us, all the whole world in late in 1918, 1919, for example. Let's all bring all those negatives into effect. But the important point at the end, there was 6 million population in Sri Lanka, and we had to import 60% of the rice requirement to feed the nation. That's the reality. And 8 years later, we have 21.8 million people, and we produce more rice than what we require. And I'm not going to say we are self-sufficient, because people can always bring in argument about wheat flour consumption and so on, but still we produce much more than what we require. And this change occurred since 2008. Remember, in 2007, at that time government, and under that time Minister of Agriculture, Mr. Maithripala Sirisena, where people started the program called Apiwamu Ratanagam. I hope you remember that. And this was started in 2007, not thinking that there'll be issues after 2008, but the need was felt. And finally, we started growing more, and of course, producing more with productivity increases as well. And then since 2008, we have been happily saying that Sri Lanka is a fact, except for 2 years in 2016 and 2017. We have to wait and see what is the impact for this year, this Maha season, and next Yala season. In 2021, we had a good year so far until the end of Yala season. But the problems have started in Maha season, where the yield will be harvested next year. So all that calculations will go for next year. What has happened this year, thanks to the Maha season that started last year in October, ended up in February this year, and the Yala season started in March theoretically and ended up in September this year. So those are the things that we have to calculate and consider very carefully whenever the time the statistics are presented to all of us. Please keep that in mind in my presentation as well. All right, before 1940s, by the time 1940s, we grew only traditional rice varieties. And when it comes to 2020, 98% of the paddy land cultivated, people calculated as totally about 1.3 million hectares of paddy land being cultivated in 2 seasons, Yala and Maha together. And say people talk about roughly 800 plus hectares of paddy land that is being made available in Sri Lanka. Whatever said and done, still 98% of the extent has been cultivated to high yielding varieties, thanks to the hybridization program that was carried out since 1952 by giants in plant breeding like Dr. Hector Veeraratne. And finally, in 1958, we saw the light of having H4, the variety, the old improved variety H4, which is a cross between Murungakayan 302, a variety that we claim to be ours, and also an imported rice variety from Indonesia called MAS, M-A-S. This cross helped us to bring up H4 variety. And that was a starting point where we went through later BG, AT, LD, and BW varieties to produce new high yielding varieties. We have produced 2 hybrids up to now, one in 1995 and one in early 21st century, but we do not cultivate commercially hybrid rice in Sri Lanka. All what we cultivate are the new improved varieties, which are the pure lines that have been developed by the country, by the breeding programs, thanks to our breeders, agronomists, and everyone who have committed and affected a lot to make sure this development take place in Sri Lanka. Coming back to my presentation, 100% was traditional varieties in 1940, and more than 98% are new high yielding varieties. If you look at the calculation, the traditional varieties are actually less than 2% in terms of cultivated extent in this country. And we use traditional technologies. We are still proud of that. And we did not use agrochemicals, at least for rice cultivation, because the first record of use of fertilizer came up in 1952. Then the subsidy started being given in 1961-62. So those are the formal information that have been available. There have been many missing information for me, but I'm sure you may be knowing much more than me. But the important thing is this is how the agriculture has evolved. And we did not use agrochemicals in 1940, but when it comes to 2020, we used new technologies and we used agrochemicals, synthetic fertilizers, and pesticide. Going back to 1940, our average paddy yield was 0.65 tons per hectare. 0.65 tons. That's why people like Dr. Hector Veeraratne thought that we have to go and build up new varieties, and they gave the initiative after 6 years of labor. 60 years of labor, a lot of effort. In 1958, we were able to get H4, as I told you, and the yield was made to have a leap jump forward from a mere 0.65 tons per hectare and to 1.5 tons per hectare in 1958. But later, after all these developments taking place, our average paddy yield now in most of the yellow seasons and mass season goes about 4.8 tons per hectare as well. It mostly lies somewhere between 4.7 to 4.8. So the yield increase, the productivity increase, thanks to the Green Division, thanks to the effort, more importantly, all the efforts laid down and implemented by the farming community in this country has made sure over these 80 years, the productivity, rice productivity or paddy productivity has shown a 7.4-fold increase in terms of yield. And some people always have started arguing, no, the extent has also increased. Yes, extent has increased, but the cultivated extent of paddy has increased only by less than twofold. Look at the leap jump forward that we have had in terms of productivity, important part. And the life expectancy in 1940 was 46 years. Life expectancy, and when you come to life expectancy now is about 76 years. Now all these things is not to say grow organic and die at 46. No, that is not the message. Everything was achieved. All these improvements was achieved with the contribution of many other things. It's the research and extension, health services, education, food and nutrition status of the country, and more importantly, increased adoption of new technology. Now this development as an example, this is the development, this is the condition that has put forward the current scenario that people, our government has started reversing. I'm going to tell you why I'm telling is reversing. And that's exactly what has happened. And all these reversal stories that put forward me are evidence-based. That's what I'm going to tell you. Why I'm going to tell this? I'm sure you know about this historical research paper. A research carried out at Bathalagada Rice Research Institute from 2003 to 2014 continuously for 11 years. That means 22 cultivated seasons continuously. The one plot was mega plot was application of organic matter only, one plot with no organic matter, and then comes a plot with conventional fertilizers only, and finally a plot with conventional fertilizer and organic fertilizer combined. And there were 3 replicates as usual. They were bigger plots, each carrying 100 square meters. So that's how the research was done. Continuous application every season, and this is the end results that came up. The pink color is the organic matter applied plots. Is done at Bathalagada Rice Research Institute, and the overall result was published in 2016. And what it very clearly says, it was published in Tropical Agriculturist, the oldest international journal in terms of agriculture, probably in the whole world, probably in Asia, if not the whole world. Sorry, let me put it that way. So this journal very clearly says that forget about comparing everything. If you apply organic matter only, the yield of paddy in all these 22 seasons continuously has shown in both Yala and Maha seasons average 21.5 reduction of 21.5% to 31.5% compared to inorganic fertilizer applied plots. And the highest yield in all cases have been experienced in plots that carried both inorganic fertilizer, the synthetic fertilizer, that's not the correct word to be, synthetic fertilizer and organic fertilizer. That's an important message that scientists have given. This study still continues at Bathalagada, and still this long-term combination of having yield equal to that of conventional type, as we call it, from organic has never been achieved. These are the results that is very clearly stated. And this is how we brought up the idea saying that this decision, ill-fated decision has been taken, is not taking the country's economy in the correct course. This is why I said is academia and scientists have to come up with these actual facts and show to the government. Government, ministers, presidents need not know everything. It's all the matter rests with the information that has been fed into them. Even though they will have their own whims and fancies, it's at the job of the scientists come forward and tell this information, give this information correctly to the general public and the policymakers. All the things that have been done in the past are clearly reflected in the Global Food Security Index that has been published in the 21st century. And if you look at all the scenarios that have been created, Sri Lanka was at a better position or in the best position in the global food security when you look at Southeast Asia. In 2020, last year, tables changed. I'm not going to present that data because I still think COVID-19 and the impact on our economy I mean, there's a different scale when you compare with other South Asian countries. So let me go back to the last normal year. And I'm sure we can bring in more information from 2021 as well. But up to 2019, since this the index was formed, remember, lower the index, that means the country is in a better position in terms of food security. So Thailand, Vietnam, and Indonesia were holding better position than Sri Lanka. And Sri Lanka was at number 66 in 2019. And our position have been varying from 64 to 66, 62 to 66, like that. And that's the range. And every time, all other countries like India, Pakistan, Nepal, and Bangladesh were below us in terms of achieving food security. And look at this map as well. Look at the greener color where Sri Lanka is in. That's to give you an indication, the better position that we held in terms of this food security index that was developed based on 34 and 13 countries, of course, on affordability, availability, safety, and quality. Please do remember that. Now, these are the indicators that have been used by people to come up with this, and that is by the economic, well-known organization called Economic Intelligence Unit. And what we have done right now is that without assessing and analyzing all these past gains, past information that we have gained with respect to productivity, we have taken a wrong course, wrong direction, very unfortunately. And remember, I told you food security can be measured in two ways. One thing is maximizing the contribution of agriculture. The second point is by importing food to fill whatever the gap. Even to import food, the important part is to have foreign exchange to do that. We know the crisis situation that are in. Tea is one of the most important agricultural crops in terms of gaining foreign exchange. Until now, please do remember, Sri Lanka tea fetches relatively higher prices because Sri Lanka tea or Ceylon tea is being considered as the cleanest tea. And that doesn't mean there's no impurities in Sri Lanka tea, but compared to everywhere in the world, Sri Lanka is the cleanest tea. And a very interesting data was published in 2019 in this internationally recognized journal to compare and something called hazard index, being tea imported to Iran from Sri Lanka, black tea, and from India. And you can very clearly say that Sri Lankan tea is highly positioned in terms of hazard index and in terms of being considered as one of the cleanest tea, safest tea in the whole world. Every item, please do remember, people talk about vasa and visa, every poisonous material. I mean, we all heard about this story. The saying, factually correct, called dose make the poison. Higher the dosage, anything that you consider as a medicine can be a poisonous substances. I'm not going to talk about it further on this matter. And please do remember, it's because of these conditions, the impacts that have been seen through research and impacts seen through from personal experiences and so on, with scientific facts still, looking at the historical developments that I told you. The Sri Lanka Agriculture Economics Association in June this year came up with some sparkling information. I must tell you, showing that future is going to be very bleak in organic agriculture because of the absence of required nutrients. We know the problem with organic fertilizer and so on. This is the level of yield losses that they predicted at the beginning, assuming that pest and disease control is going to happen correctly in the correct order. So they have removed the pest and disease issues separately, considering that this control have been taking place correctly. Even the yield losses predicted by Batalagoda through research, they always made sure by adding organic matter, they tried to supply the required nutrient content, but they made sure pest and disease control, including weeds, were done by using conventional techniques. So irrespective of that, you had still 21.5 to 31.5% yield loss. That's something that you have to keep in mind always. And this is what the Sri Lanka Agricultural Economics Association also said that's going to happen. And with all that, ladies and gentlemen, this graph tells you very clearly what has happened in the past. Just to summarize things that I said, what has happened in the past with respect to rice yield. The red line is the requirement, the blue line is the production. Remember, I told you since 2008, we have been producing more rice than we require, except in few years that there were climatic changes and so on. But still, we have been moving well. And look at what has happened in 2020. Now, 2020 yield comprises of the Maha season 2019-2020 and Yellow season 2020. The Maha season 2020-2021 will be counted for the year 2021, which we do not have the overall aspect of production because the Yellow season data will have to come into effect to give you the overall production. We still do it with the correct information. Let's wait and the EGSTAT information is released to get the official information. So this is something that people did not consider. And the myths and things came up is that saying that Sri Lanka, this decision was taken saying that Sri Lanka uses more fertilizer and more pesticides per unit land area or per capita, giving us a lot of problems in the case of environmental damages and non-communicable disease with respect to human beings. This is the message. I'm telling you, this is the myth or the baseless argument that has been put forward to people, the policymakers, to make this tool that push them towards making this decision. But we scientists kept quiet. We didn't want to even correct course at the time. The academia kept quiet. We didn't want to correct course even at that time. I'm showing you two slides with respect to fertilizer use, kilogram per hectare of cropland. This is what has happened up to 2018 when you look at FAO-stat data. I could not extract the 2019 data. Usually it takes 2 years, for example, for FAO to come up with data that can be compared across countries, all countries. So I opted for 5 developed nations. China, well, they call it developing country, that's fine. Australia, China, Japan, Netherlands, and South Korea. Look at the way that they have used fertilizer kilogram per hectare of cropland. I'm going to share these slides with you. There's no issue. These are not hidden data. These data are available in the public domain. Only thing that I've done is use little bit of time and energy to bring these facts in a figure so that people can understand. This is what is happening in the developed countries. And people always harp about Australia saying that they use the lowest quantity of fertilizer, 85 kilograms, say 86 kilograms per hectare of cropland. Remember, in majority of the areas, Australia cultivate one season or one time per year in terms of seasonal crop, but they go ahead with their perennial crops as well. But just keep this data. Don't worry about what they cultivate. Keep this data. Now look at what is happening in South Asia, because I want to show you that there is always an alleged claim that Sri Lanka uses the highest quantity of synthetic fertilizer, which is not correct, which is an incorrect information, even if you compare what is going on with respect to fertilizer usage in the country. 2015 was a peculiar in this country where people use a lot of fertilizer because the extent of cultivation expanded dramatically in 2015 because of favorable weather. Before 2019, 2015 was one of the best years that we had in terms of weather. And people went ahead with cultivation spree, naturally to support that cultivation, the planned cultivated extent, by all research institutes and Department of Agriculture made sure more fertilizer was brought to Sri Lanka. Look at the 2018 data, 2016 data, 2017 data. 2016, 2017, there you can always say there's been an issue in Sri Lanka because cultivated extent was less because of the serious drought that we faced, failing 3 continuous cultivating seasons, where Sri Lanka was prompted and we had to import about 700,000 metric tons of rice to feed our nation over 3.5-month period. That's what happened. So if the drought happens, this is the issue. And look at other decisions make productivity loss. What would be our plight? That is where there's something that we have to understand. When people do not analyze this information, and even if the people like you and me who analyze this information do not provide this information, or we do not have access to provide this information, both matters a lot, then the issues of this nature arises. So this is the information with respect to the synthetic fertilizer. This is what I'm saying. These are all gross lies that are being put forward in front of people. And let me take the pesticide issue. Same 5 developed countries. Look at where Australia is once again. 2.0 kilograms of pesticides in general per hectare of cropland. Now let me come to the Sri Lankan scenario to show you where we are. Look at where we are. 0.95, and India is the country that's below us. And when you look at the other kind, of course, Bhutan, Nepal, they were originally using the low quantities of fertilizer. We all know that jolly well. But then these are the scenarios in terms of agriculturally. I mean, agriculture is considered countries that agriculture is considered as an important component of the economy. So these are, unfortunately, we kept quiet when the things are brewing up. And we cannot blame many other people, but academia from agriculture, field of agriculture, who kept quiet, even either have not done the analysis or even after doing analysis, keeping our mouth shut. And that is not the role play that is expected by academia like you and me. And let me also tell you about another myth that has been spread across. There's always alleged involvement of agrochemicals for non-communicable diseases like CKDU. I'm not a medical professional to talk about this, but let me bring up an extract of the discussion that was held by chairman of National Research Council, Professor Hemant Dharampal, on 14 June in the ITN Dhoramandala program. If you can go and watch it, still it is in the web, please go and watch it. In Sinhala, this is what he said. I take the responsibility of this translation. I did it, assuming it one-to-one. He says that long-term studies conducted by NRC, he was referring to that, concluded recently has revealed that the two main reasons for is the low intake of drinking water and fluoride content in water. Though heavy metals were considered earlier as the causal factor, it is not. This is what Professor Hemant Dharampal said. I'm quoting him. And he also said this report has been submitted to Ministry of Health. We tried to have access to such a report, but unfortunately we could not. We know there's another committee that has been appointed to look at the historical evolution of the impact of using fertilizers and pesticides in the environment. Good move. I must tell you, good move. We have to welcome such moves, but there is some information like this as well that we have to consider. Then comes in the recent past, ladies and gentlemen, another myth coming up saying that the cancer incidences. So what I thought was I went to the Global Cancer Observatory, though I'm not a person to talk about cancer, but the cancer incident gives a very important message for all of us with respect to when you try to compare the use of fertilizer and pesticide. All what I'm giving this to you is not to teach you about how agriculture has performed or to do that, but to tell you how the country has been taken on a ride by people who give misinformation and how the governments have gone on a ride continuously, even after understanding probably what the information given is not correct. And this is what I'm trying to prove you, and then to make sure that we as academia make sure that such scenarios will not occur anyway in the future in any field of study. So this is what the Global Cancer Observatory say. I took 3 examples: Australia, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh. Remember, I showed you the fertilizer and pesticide usage earlier. Take Australia, for example. Their fertilizer use was the lowest, 85 kilograms. Their pesticide use in developing countries is the lowest, about 2.03 kilograms per hectare. And their cancer prevalence for the past 5 years is about 3,172 per million people. Okay, now let's take Sri Lanka. Fertilizer use 138 in 2018. Pesticide use 0.95 kilograms per hectare in 2018. And our cancer prevalence is about 354. If you want to look at the rate that it increases, you can also visit this website and get to know of it. It's simple fact. This is a 5-year average I'm telling you. Now let's take Bangladesh. Remember the values that Bangladesh had in fertilizer and pesticide use? They had 318 kilograms, much above Australia and Sri Lanka. And pesticide use was below Australia, but much above Sri Lanka. And their cancer prevalence is the lowest. What are we talking about? Once we bring these real facts into picture, analyze the trends in the past, and look for future, the important point is to understand the decisions that have been made in Sri Lanka is not the benefit for agriculture. And this is the story that I told you I'm going to bring up to the Bhutan. And I'm going to teach you about Bhutan. But remember, Bhutan went ahead, since I'm going to share this slide, Bhutan went ahead to become organic. They announced it in 2014. But by 2018, they had to reverse the decision because they found that more than 50% of their food requirement is being imported. That is the end result of that organic story. And then come to Cuba. people talk heavily about Cuba, and Cuban food security has to be put forward, rested on the World Food Program in 2020. They came up and said Cuba is importing 70 and 80% of their food requirement. They have gone organic. Of course, their cities have gone organic. Their home gardens have gone organic. City home garden, that is true. But remember, their major production is sugar. And the way they use pesticides, especially herbicides, is, of course, for the benefit of their own country in terms of increasing productivity. But the true picture is this. And if you want to look at, they're all published information. If you want to look at what is happening in Cuba and Bhutan in terms of organic agriculture, I'm not talking about eco-friendly agriculture, about organic agriculture, which we know an extreme. That is what people wanted to bring at a given time in this country over the past 7 months, since the decision was taken to ban importation of synthetic fertilizer and pesticides on 27th April. Look at what is happening in Cuban agriculture. In Cuba, the black line, even there's a 61% reduction in organic agriculture extent. Remember, I told you that only 1.5% of the total agricultural land has gone organic. Okay, and Bhutan is maintaining a decision to keep it right over there, and only about 1.3% of their agricultural land is fixed for organic agriculture. They are worried they are not going to move along ahead with organic agriculture in such a hurry. Of course, organic agriculture can be done, but of course, there are different ways. And since we started talking about banning importation, remember, express their view saying that they are going to help Sri Lanka go organic. Scientists from India, also well-respected scientists, tell that we'll never allow Sri Lanka to reverse this decision of going organic. But while saying so, mind you, India is the largest urea producer in the world. And while being the largest urea producer, they are also net importer of urea. That means they are worried about their food security. They make sure urea is being used in their agriculture, of course, for other industries as well, so that India makes sure India will look after its own food security. Look at what is next. Russia produced only about 9 million metric tons. And what has happened right now with the price increase that we always face is China has stopped exporting urea, even the limited countries they wanted to export. And Russia has curtailed their exports of urea, creating a scarcity of urea in the world market, making sure price has got skyrocketed. Mind you, October, November, December, the last quarter of the year, every year, the fertilizer prices have gone up because of the nature that they are being produced. But this year is extraordinary. Even the countries that who wanted to export did not fear in their food security under this pandemic. So I'm telling you, people may advise us to go ahead with organic, but people are not keeping up to their word in their own nations. Look at the European Green Deal. I'm sure you heard a lot of European countries extend their wishes and support to Sri Lanka to make sure. Even diplomatic missions came up in doing so. But look at where EU is looking at. EU is a group of countries, of course, we always take as an example to go organic and to look at their pristine environments and so on, which is not the correct explanation. I'm not going to talk about it, but remember in their farm to fork strategy, EU has set a target of, they even say it's an ambition target that at least 25% of the EU's agricultural land are organic by in 10 years time. 25% only. Of course, it can go beyond that because they say at least. And also, their target is that to reduce the nutrient losses by at least 50%. We all know there's a Colombo declaration on this, and to reduce the use of fertilizer by at least 20% by 2030. That's their target always when we go ahead with that. That's how Europe, you look at there. Remember, there was a group of even Swiss scientists came to Sri Lanka trying to support Sri Lankan organic agriculture. But on June 13, when Swiss went on to a public voting for a decision that they want to remove synthetic pesticides in the country, and all farmers voted against that. 60 people voted, 60.6% of the country's people voted against this decision, and Swiss finally decided, no, we are going to continue with the synthetic pesticides because that's about the food security. That's how they are worried about the food security. So, ladies and gentlemen, with all that coming up, role of academia, once again, after the first few slides, let me come back to this last slide to tell you what's going to happen, what we should do. We should not be scared at any cost, I must tell you, that to bust the myth, and make evidence-based communication to the public as well, not going by once again on your own whims and fancies. And also we should equip ourselves with data and do not declare our own opinion if you do not have the correct facts. If you do not have the correct facts to argue, if you are wrong, let's correct ourselves. That's fine. When you put out the facts, if somebody challenges, when we identify we are wrong, immediately let us correct ourselves and have our argument straight once again without shying away. If you try to do something wrong from the very beginning, then we are in trouble. That's the important message once again that I want to give you. And let us focus well. Once again, as I told you, do not shy away with harsh comments from the society. You may be, I have been tagged enough saying that I'm getting money from the private sector to back the fertilizer issue. I mean, I don't care. I mean, those things are not going to hit me hard. The important point, what I'm doing as an individual, what many other individuals in the academia are doing is looking at safeguarding the food security of this country and make sure agriculture prospers while minimizing any detrimental impact, any negative impact of all agricultural inputs, as well as the practical implications that we have based on the recommendations and so on. And do not, in our effort, do not denounce or condemn someone individually or something individually. That's not going to do. I mean, this denounce and condemning is not what's going to happen. But the important part is if a policy decision is wrong, we have to correct that rather than denouncing or condemning the person who makes that policy decision. We may come up with in general terms because people will have to understand at a given point, though I put this forward, I'm not contradicting my own argument once, but people will have to understand the messages that have been given to the hierarchy are not correct. The information that have been given to the hierarchy are not correct, assuming that those have led to this decision making that has taken place. And ladies and gentlemen, finally, we have to be future-proof. We have to prepare for future crises. Not that we are bringing into or we are poking our finger into any other person's field of study. No, let's try to be future-proof as academia and make sure academia will not be obsolete. Academia will not be pinpointed again for taking a backseat. Academia will not be blamed saying that they have not intervened positively and proactively in decision making in this country and implementation of things on ground, whichever the field that it's going to be, and to make sure that they are done in such a way that it will have a scientific base and it will give benefits in the foreseeable future to this society. And I think that is our role play. Thank you very much, Auta, for giving me this opportunity. And thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your patience hearing. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Marambe. Professor Harishana, over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Marambe, for that extremely informative and very, very useful intervention for our members at this moment. I think all our members have seen the public role that has been played by Professor Marambe and a number of other agriculturists in the country in intervening in this crisis. And I think he reminded us of something very important, particularly when the country is facing this moment of deep crisis. As academics, we can no longer consider it as business as usual. Our national role, we are being called upon to act on that national role. We have various disciplinary specialties, and it is important that our voices are heard. I don't want to take up too much time, but I just wanted to mention one thing. I mean, we are in a trade union forum, so I think I can afford to be a little political as well. Amartya Sen, the Indian economist, has made a very interesting observation about correlations between famines and the political order of a country. And he has observed that historically famines have occurred in countries without participatory decision-making systems, essentially countries lacking democracy. And he has shown this with statistics. So I think this is also a conversation about the future of democracy in this country and how voices of reason, voices of science need to be heard in policy making, and we have to demand that our voices are heard and that this decision making is informed in that sense. So with that, we will open this out to questions and answers and comments from the audience. Once again, thank you to Professor Marambe. You can either use the chat box or just raise your hand and you can speak.
Professor Ramukela, there is a question I think I can take up from Nimsha Virakudi. Yeah, okay. Professor Piratna has also raised his hand, but
I know you can respond to Nimsha's one first.
Yeah, how can we overcome the current situation? Any possible means and ways? When certain thing we always say in Sinhala, I mean, I have to bring up something similar to that. It's a very unfortunate response that I'm going to give you. I face this question everywhere, but then when things go beyond control, when the decisions that are made have already started showing us the repercussions, even before we expected those things to happen, there's very little that we can do at this stage. One way to tackle it, there is, I mean, I'm not a person who is supportive of giving subsidy right across borders. I'm not a person. I mean, there are people who can afford, when the affordability is there, subsidy is not going to be an issue, especially when input subsidies come into action. The fertilizer prices are very high. Government has taken decision to revoke the 2 gazette notifications that were issued, one on 6th May, the other one is on 31st July. Basically limiting the importation of agrochemicals, those are for synthetic fertilizer and synthetic pesticides for agricultural use. That those 2 gazettes were lifted on 30th November. When those 2 gazettes were lifted, the gazette that was there in operation in 2017 will become effective again. That is to show that the fertilizers and pesticides can be imported in the normal manner through regulatory control to this country. There was no issue on that. And I think what we have to do is right now is initiating a discussion with countries like India. I mean, it's good to look at nano fertilizers, nano urea and so on. But even with higher prices of synthetic fertilizers, this is the time country needs a good subsidy scheme where the mostly needed people will at least get a booster to make sure their agriculture will take place in some way, at least to provide the food requirement of their own. This is an important point. But remember, the impact of Maha season is already in. We cannot revert back this impact now. Only thing that we can see is at least to make sure our Yalla season next year, starting from March, April, May, so on, will not fail. And if at all we are to take a decision to import the most required agricultural imports, please do remember, for importation, it will take about 2 months from the time of placing the order. So let's prepare for doing it. I'm sure you all know, fertilizer business or any importation that has been done as a routine practice, people know when to order depending on the international market prices. If you look at the historical developments in the past, you will very clearly understand Sri Lanka has imported fertilizer either in March, April period or July, August, September. And even the fertilizer that was imported this year towards latter part of April could not come in because of the gazette notification issued on 6th May 2021, because it clearly said, even if you have ordered fertilizer, if the ship has not sailed by 5th June, that means 5th May, day before the gazette was issued, then those shipments will not allowed to be unloaded. That was a decision taken. So we lost that fertilizer consignment. And in July, August, September, we did not order synthetic fertilizers because of the gazette that was in effect. Now that restriction has been imported. Now the problem is the price, world market price. So this is the time to think of a good set of negotiations and also looking at a fair enough subsidy scheme. I'm sure economists will help in doing that to the country. So make sure at least certain part of the cultivated land rescued partly, not fully, even rescued partly in this Maha season. Some people may argue on this with me, but please do remember there is considerable amount of paddy land. I'm talking of paddy land only. Paddy land, for example, that started cultivating late because people were waiting until fertilizer to arrive. So at least try to safeguard those things. That is one of the way out. That's what I think. Thank you.
Professor Piratna, you can ask your question.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Marabe. Very interesting and thought-provoking presentation. Key points, of course, you were talking about myths and facts. That is really impressed me. Right now, my focus is towards, revising course material, curriculum, etc. There are a lot of pressure coming from outside parties, politicians, and also some of the academics who serve as policymakers, etc., telling our curriculum is outdated, etc. Of course, there are areas that we should be revising. But in this context, I was thinking they first spread the myth and they want us to revise the curriculum according to their needs. So I'd like to get your comments on this dimension. Thank you.
I think thanks, Professor Pierratta. This is a very serious thing that I'm listening from you. I mean, that's a very important point that you put forward as well. See, people spread a myth and make sure the policymakers take the whole society on a right and ask the academia in turn to get on board and put the whole country in a doldrum with respect to future. And this should not happen, I think. What we have to teach our students to stand by the truth, stand by the evidence, and make sure they express that as well. So what I strongly feel is that now, while saying so, Professor Pierratta, nobody should get an understanding that I'm trying to let down organic agriculture. Organic agriculture and organic farming is an entirely different ballgame. We have to support that, and there have been people who are doing organic farming in this country and have been earning a good buck, I must tell you, bringing in foreign exchange. We have to support that entity. It's a parallel process. But remember, we are talking about country's food security. When you don't have a scientific background, even to develop a curriculum, my argument is that it's again scientifically based. There's no point getting across a message to our student which does not have a scientific base. And I mean, I don't like to use the word curse, but the future generation will be cursing us then, taking them on a right, for example, rather than the existing society. We have to be very careful, analytical, and bring the truth, the facts into effect even when we develop a curriculum.
Other comments and questions? I think Professor Marabe raised a number of issues we can engage with. So I would encourage our members to take this opportunity as well. Okay, since nobody is, yeah, yes, Dilip, yes, go ahead.
Professor Marabe, I would like to know your opinion about your plan for organic agriculture as well. I mean, you said you are not denying that.
Yeah,
and I mean, organic agriculture has a place in this in the entire agriculture system.
yes.
So, what is your plan for? Suggestion for organic agriculture?
If at all organic agriculture to be promoted in this country, there are areas that we can work on it. Take even paddy, even tea. Not all the country can be converted into organic when you look at the materials that are available. That's one thing. The second point is we have to understand that organic agricultural inputs cannot provide the required nutrients or required protection for a crop that we cultivate, especially if you want to do organic agriculture and also want to ensure country's food security by having higher productivity. So these two things will not go together. If at all we are going to do organic, I think there are zones that we have to identify and convert so that those things can be used for low input agriculture first, and then gradually convert those things into fully organic, like what India did. When India decided that Sikkim province has to go fully organic, targeting on tourism, not on food security, and they particularly selected Sikkim. They agreed to the proposition of Sikkim province also because originally their productivity has been the lowest and they have been using very low amount of synthetic inputs historically. So people are in a system that are used to a low input production system, which have always been importing their products to feed their own people in the province. So importing from other provinces. So, I mean, that's one of the models that we can think, not to make sure province go down in terms of economy. But let's take areas like Western province, for example. close to city areas. Let's identify land that has not been converted into organic agriculture yet. Let's have a plan for conversion. And let's make sure all the inputs that are available be made into a good quality material at the end and support that agriculture with an adequate conversion period. That's the only way this organic agriculture extent can be expanded with a purpose, not for a vision or not for a mission that cannot be achieved. So that is my point. There's always zoning that can be done. There's always crop selection that can be done. And targeting what? That's the important thing that we have to consider. If you are targeting on export promotion, one way of doing that, trying to make sure certain areas being identified for export purposes. We definitely have lower yields, for example, but definitely higher incomes coming as foreign exchange that will support countries' food security in another way, so that we have more required or much required fertilizers, so the foreign exchange to bring in material to this country. This will not work across the country when you look at food security. I repeat, a country cannot go fully organic in any situation in the whole world, because that will definitely affect the food security. Enough examples being provided elsewhere, unless you are very strong in your income. Take Liechtenstein, I think, one of the European Union countries. Their overall extent is 36,000 square kilometers. It's a very small country. And Liechtenstein, I think, I think I have pronounced it correctly, 41% of their land has been converted into organic agriculture, and they are not expanding it further as well, from 36,000 hectares, and their per capita income is about $98,000. Now just imagine the purchasing power that they have, so that they have enough capacity to bring in food whenever the time that they go. I mean, they find difficulties in doing their own food and supporting their food security. So Dilip, the important thing is, once you select the land, once you select the crop, and of course you have the adequate inputs to be provided to support the certification part as well, then and only then that you can grow organic and go organic. That is my point. Thank you very much.
Professor, maybe another question. Now, I mean, I do agree with you that it's a disastrous decision to go for organic overnight, and and the other question I would like to ask you is, I mean, so there is at least a small trend, or not a small trend, but trend in the world to go for organic. So is it based on a myth? I mean, according to your entire presentation, I mean, that's what I gathered. Like, I mean, there's no reason for go for organic, but for some reason people are advocating for that. So what is the reason?
People can have your own perception. If you want to go vegetarian, for example, though I'm a non-veg, I cannot push you towards being vegetarian, being non-veg, isn't it? And it's very difficult for you also until I do not change my perception, for example, maybe on different ground. Remember, I told you, I also have my own whims and fancies. I have my whims and fancies, and I will try to realize them based on my own income, my own expenditure capacity, and so on. We are talking about a country here, but even in those countries, I mean, take the standards that they have, Dilip, for example, those countries have already damaged their soils adequately by overusing things, by overusing agricultural inputs. In countries like ours, we are controlling it heavily, even the use of inputs. Because of the new high-yielding varieties, we are getting more productivity compared to the inputs that we use. And in such a scenario, we cannot spread a myth that we are going to achieve conditions like in Sikkim or any other country. That's the myth I was talking about. And the myth I was talking about a little while ago about the reasons that were given to the government, as we have seen in terms of documents and on news items, to show that this is why the government of Sri Lanka decided to go into organic or to do this conservation. And all those matters, all those propositions that were made by people are based on myths. That's my point. But a perception, I cannot change. Perceptions definitely will move forward. For example, nowadays, if you go through the global community and especially youth, they are going for spicy food. Whichever the way that is being produced, the trend is go for spicy food. And Sri Lanka is exploiting that kind of situation to make sure quality spices are being produced, organic or not, quality spices are being produced to the global market to capture this trend. When the world market goes towards Ceylon tea, ignoring whether it's organically grown or not, Ceylon tea, then of course what we are trying to do is to capture that market. Now, why do people go for Ceylon tea, for example? Why people do not go into Kenyan tea and Indian tea? Why people look for Ceylon tea? Why people look for Ceylon cinnamon, for example? And those are the matters, perception-based matters that we have to consider. So please do take it in that spirit. When I say myths, it's about the reasons that have been given to the government of Sri Lanka to make these dishes. They are not factual. That was the point that I'm making.
Okay, I think Dr. Trikavala has raised his hand. Dr. Trikavala?
Yeah. First of all, thank you very much, Professor Marabe, for an excellent presentation. I think I am part of this as well, because as you said, so we have to raise our hands. The question is, I'm asking is much related to Dr. Nimsha pointed out. So I would like to know the current situation, how worse it is because of this banning the inorganic fertilizer importation, and how bad it is. I mean, there are several reasons along with that, like prolonged raining, right, as well as some political opportunities.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, when the ban was,
So I would like to know how bad it is.
At the time the ban was imposed on 27th April, later by a gazette notification on 6th May, there was fertilizer that was import and agrochemical, other pesticides that were imported to this country, especially pesticides in adequate quantities for the yellow season. You know, pesticide scenario is different to fertilizers. When pesticide is purchased, according to the current law, you can keep it in store for 2 years. So the same pesticide that has been purchased can be used for several seasons depending on the volume. And apart from that, people who had the purchasing power, like the regional plantation companies in tea, rubber, and so on, and also wealthier farmers, they made sure there was a buying spree in the case of fertilizers and most of the pesticides. So when the Maha season started this season, though there was no fertilizer being imported targeting Maha season and no pesticides being imported targeting Maha season, and mind you, Dr. Trikavala, both pesticides and fertilizers were banned. We simply cannot ignore that, though I only mainly spoke about fertilizer right now. When the season started, there were certain cases, there were fertilizer in stock, though not in adequate quantities. You know, if you take paddy cultivation, paddy, the urea fertilizer, for example, has to be provided at a rate of 225 kilograms per hectare during the cultivation period of a crop. And this 225 kilograms per hectare is applied in 4 splits. 4 times, 3 to 4 times, depending on the growth duration of the crop. And people had, in certain cases, to apply fertilizer in the first and second location. But nowadays, when the people have started cultivating paddy at earlier situation, having kind of a self-assurance about the fertilizer, they are in trouble, because at the time of panicle initiation and the time of heading, we need another dose of urea fertilization or nitrogen fertilization in adequate quantities to make sure the flag leaf development takes place physiologically, so that the yield increment can be dramatic. That's a process that we do, and that's a scientifically accepted process. Now the point is that even the people who started cultivating earlier are now facing trouble in giving the 3rd and 4th dosages of the nitrogen that is mostly required by the crop. Now, this is the issue. We can cultivate paddy land. If you speak to the Director General of Agriculture, he will definitely tell you, out of the 800,000 plus hectares to be cultivated in the Maha season, about 782,000 hectares have been cultivated. That may be true in terms of land preparation and cultivation, but just broadcasting paddy does not mean you are going to get an economically important harvest unless the proper management practices have been done. This is where the issue starts. Now, the danger, as I always say, is I go by the estimates done by Sri Lanka Agricultural Economics Association, and I fear even more because of lack of proper weed control and lack of proper insect pest and disease control, because though people have material in store, they may not be in adequate quantities. And sometimes people try to ignore the paddy field. That's a human nature. When the paddy seedlings will not start growing at a rate that we have experienced in the past to grow, because they by experience know if the tillering takes place at this level, then of course the yield will be increasing dramatically and rapidly towards the latter part of the crop growth. So the future for Mahasisa, while explaining all those things, in my own scientific explanation, is not going to be good. The yield losses will be dramatic, but I still want to stay with the how do you call the consecutive measures, estimates that are conservative measures that have been done by the Sri Lanka Agricultural Economics Association, considering only fertilization. They have not brought in the factor of pesticides and fungicide. So the important point, there will be a dramatic reduction in yield with respect to paddy production and other crops in this country, in this Mahasisa. It's a grave situation, I must tell you.
Thank you very much, Marumi, Professor Marumi. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Professor Marabe. I also have a short question. Now, given the anticipated yield loss, are you aware districts that are responsible for food security in the country? Is there any plan to import rice, import other crops that, where the production is going to be insufficient? Is there any plans in place at the moment? Or?
That is important for future. You are quite right. When you consider the yield that we obtained in the Mahaseason 2020-2021, which we harvested in January, February, and March this year, and the Yala season, which we harvested in August and September this year, when you have a cumulative value, we have a very good harvest coming from previous Maha and this Yala. And the rice that we mill out of that, provided that farming community is going to sell the paddy that they have produced to the millers or any other, then of course our rice requirement can be met by whatever the things that are in store until for about April, May. But that is provided farming community will sell their product, because we all know out of the harvest that people take, about 25 to 30% are kept in store for the own use of farmers, as well as to be used as seed paddy in the next cultivating season. So about 70% is the one, roughly about 70% of the harvest will come to the market. Now, a good season, good 2 seasons, provided this season will also provide definitely some yield. Some yield is going to be there, it's not the anticipated yield. When you add to that, we can run until about say May, June, for example, when you look at the overall scenario. But the problem is, once again, though I brought in rice or paddy as an example, that is not the only product that we are going to consider. Look at what is happening right now in the case of vegetables and other field crops. A pathetic situation. Maize production is heavily affected. We need about 480,000 of maize, metric tons of maize annually to make sure animal feed is produced to support the poultry industry. Now look at this chain reaction that is going to create. That's what I said. The future is not good. As I tell you, I do not want to use the term bleak. Not good, mainly because looking at the whole chain, whole gamut of activities that take place in the agriculture sector. That's why I said at the very beginning, the much needed nutritional components in terms of synthetic fertilizer, those two people can blame that have been supported by the fertilizer importing agency while saying this. The important thing is we have to get them down and make sure a subsidy program being adopted in a better way, not trying to give it free of charge right across borders, but a better way to make sure the much needed people will be getting the required amount of nutrients to be provided to their crop, rice, vegetables, maize, and any crop, so that the anticipated loss can be mitigated to a certain extent. That's the way forward, I think.
Do we have any other questions or comments? If there are none, I would just like to make a small final comment. I mean, if Professor Marabe likes, he can also add to this. I mean, I come from a social sciences and humanities background, and I think Professor Marabe framed the discussion as something between a debate between myth versus science. Now, of course, from a social science perspective, you know, that division is not that clear. You know, what sometimes we consider myth, there are ideological histories to this. There are debates in the world about this, right? So I think what is really lacking in Sri Lanka is that sufficient public discussion. And that's where I think academics have failed. I mean, even take something like history. We have so many non-experts talking about history in Sri Lanka and pretending to be historians. And people believe these things. And people believe that this is an that contributes to huge social problems. Maybe not like the agricultural issue, you don't see them immediately, but generational problems, social conflict, even to militant conflict. But I'm not saying there's one version of history that is true. Like I think even the argument of science, there are debates globally. As I mean, I'm not an expert, but I know that there have been debates about the scientific method, science in general. But we need more informed discussion in the public domain, and that is not happening, so that people can then make an informed choice. So I will leave it at that. I mean, if Professor Marabe likes, you can add a short
No, thank you. Actually, you
okay,
did
then
very nicely.
Ransirini,
Thank you.
Ransirini, are you going to do the vote of thanks?
Yes. Thank you very much. So first and foremost, I would like to thank Professor Buddhi Marabe, the resource person for today, who has very kindly accepted the invitation extended by the OUTA and dedicated his time. I think we are far over time, it's 12:40, to educate the OUSL academic community about this very timely and very relevant and important discussion on agriculture crisis and the prospects of the future in Sri Lanka, as well as highlighting the role of academics in such crises. So thank you, Professor. Your talk today has really opened my eyes to the urgent agriculture issues that we're facing, as well as how we must act in the interest of the public as responsible academics. Thank you, sir. Then I also want to thank, a big thank you to Professor Harshana, moderator today, for asking key questions, guiding the discussion, and further enriching the discussion overall. Thank you, Professor Harshana. Thank you for your contribution. I also want to thank the Executive Committee of the OUTA, led by our President, Professor Anton Pierratne, for the collective effort to initiate and organize education sessions of this nature to ensure that OUSL academics are aware of the timely matters and have a forum to openly discuss and clarify such queries they may have on these regards. Thank you all. Finally, and last but not least, I want to thank all the participants today for their active participation. Your attendance and engagement encourages the OUTA Exco to organize more such lectures in the future. I sincerely hope that you have gained from this session. I know I have. Thank you all. So thank you again, and thank you all for the participation and this very thought-provoking discussion, and hope we can all do justice as academics in the public sector for the best interest of the public and our country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. I will end the meeting from my end.